Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lost Colony Murder on the Outer Banks, Seeking Justice for Brenda Joyce Holland, by John Railey, narrated by Patrick Lawlor. Author's Note: I think one thing that attracts us to islands is the sense of belonging their residents have. That is what drew me to this story as a child and keeps me there now. I spent much of my formative years in Nag's Head and often ventured to nearby Manteo. I envy the tight bonds and loyalty the Roanoke Islanders share. They are loath to tell their secrets. This is a story about an outsider, Brenda Joyce Holland, who was killed on Roanoke Island in the summer of 1967. The suspects in her slaying, some of whom were outsiders, some of whom were islanders, were each confronting what it means to belong or to be cast out. Much of this story is about flawed lawmen. I am indebted to the families of some of those men who let me in and candidly shared their loved ones' stories. Redemption rings for these men who find their footing later in the story. In this, the first nonfiction book on Brenda's unsolved case, I have relied on unique access to the sealed SBI file, hundreds of interviews with her siblings, case insiders, and other islanders telling their stories for the first time, newspaper articles, and a thick file on Brenda that her sister Kim compiled. Most of the dialogue in this book comes verbatim from those documents and interviews. Other dialogue has been recreated based on those sources. The names Rob Breeze, Molly Black, Jay Fieldman, Coy Dupree, and Houston Rob Waters are pseudonyms to protect privacy. All other names are real. The names of Manteo streets are those used in 1967 instead of names that were changed in the years afterwards. Several people in this story share the midget Midgette and Midgett surnames. None of them are directly related, although it's said on the Outer Banks that all the midget families are distantly related, tied through their proud history. John Railey, Nag's Head, North Carolina, October 2020. Personally, I doubt there is anything to know. Things happen. Good things, bad things, things no one understands. They happen. Makepeace shrugged. Life goes on. Caicos Island Commissioner Bird's Makepeace responding to an outsider's question about a local mystery in Peter Benchley's 1979 novel, The Island. Now down the trackless hollow years that swallowed them but not their song, we send response. From the opening lines of Paul Green's The Lost Colony. Prologue. Manteo, North Carolina, June 2018. It's the summer of 2018, but it might as well be half a century before, as the man is asked about the 19-year-old woman found dead in the Sound in July 1967. Brenda Joyce Holland's body, bloated past her beauty, was zipped up in a black bag and placed in a black hearse that drove her to a cold autopsy slab in Norfolk, Virginia, a city she never saw in life. This man knows things, a lot of things, and he just might talk. He hints, "You have to remember, in Manteo there are no secrets." Brenda's case has been reopened. Nobody wants to talk about it to outsiders, but Manteo never forgets. My host is cordial, offering iced water as he vapes. He is the ultimate local, and he is a private sort. But after I find my way through a Byzantine maze to our meeting spot, he receives me warmly and agrees to talk as long as his name is not used. He is impish and by turns wry and emotional as he describes a mystery man, a suspect in the case who sang in a choir like an angel. Near our meeting spot is Shallow Bag, the yacht-splashed bay that elbows around downtown Manteo. Hundreds of tourists are walking the sun-kissed streets, revitalized to the point it's sort of a cosmic blend of a New England seafaring town and a sanitized Key West. Manteo is the seat of Dare County, which takes in 80 miles of dreamy beaches. But Manteo, near the center of Roanoke Island, is very much its own deal, always has been. It's the larger of the two villages on the island, a spot of sand between mainland Dare and the Outer Banks beaches, surrounded by sounds and anchored by pines, live oaks, yaw ponds, marshlands, and its own sense of right and wrong. On the south end of the island is Wanchese, a commercial fishing bedrock and home to some of the roughest, toughest fighters in the world, whether they're hauling in catches afar in high seas in treacherous spots such as the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, or just holding their own in local bars. Manteo is just as hard. It's just quieter about it. Maybe that difference goes back to the namesakes of the two places. Manteo, the Croatan Indian who worked with those colonists who had become famously lost off his island, and Wanchese, his fellow Indian who always had a healthy dose of skepticism about the English. The villages named for those Indians, separated by fewer than 5 miles, share bloodlines if not sensibilities. But Manteo has always had its share of brutality, bruising fights in beat-down bars like Nick's House of Joy bar in California, one of the black sections of town, or in the modest white neighborhoods surrounding it. There was also hard partying and occasional brutality in the well-to-do area Mother Vineyard, at least in one house on the Roanoke Sound, where local children often played with the children of Andy Griffith, who lived nearby. The Mother Vineyard area is named for a scuppernong grapevine, several hundred years old and counting, that is believed to be the oldest cultivated grapevine in the United States. It may date back to the time of the first English colonists in 1585, even before the Lost Colony. There has always been a magic and meanness to Manteo. Brenda Holland, who'd just completed her sophomore year at Campbell College in Buies Creek, North Carolina, got the magic in the summer of 1967. It was her first time in Manteo. As the 19-year-old makeup supervisor at the Lost Colony, the nighttime outdoor drama on the island, Brenda reveled in the company made up of locals and artists from around the country. She and many of the rest, boarding in local houses, would hit the normally quiet streets of Manteo after work. The town was theirs for the summer. My host remembers how cool was the sound of their laughter, riding the soft salt breezes of the coastal night, drifting into his windows, open in the manner of the time on the island. He was 15 that summer of 1967. "I didn't know what all they were doing," he says, "but I couldn't wait to be part of it." Then he tells me about the suspect who sang like an angel in the Lost Colony choir. "This is kind of emotional for me. Danny Barber taught me to water ski." He nods at my wide eyes. Danny Barber, Brenda's date on the night she vanished, is a key suspect in the case, the main suspect for some people. He went back to college the summer after her slaying and was said to have never returned to the island. His absence ramped up a widespread belief that he'd killed Brenda. There is an iconic news photo of him from the day Brenda's body was found. Barber has been summoned to her hearse by Dare County Sheriff Frank Cahoon to identify her. The suspect wears a crew-neck blue and white striped shirt tucked neatly into belted blue jeans. His brown hair is short, and his beard is neatly trimmed. It's a close-up shot, or at least an attempted one. But Barber's head is turned to the right, his eyes masked by the angle and the glasses he wears. His buff arms are crossed at his waist. I mentioned that Barber was a fit guy. My host settles back in his seat, crosses his legs, and smiles sadly. "Yeah," he says, "he was burly, but he was nice and gentle." My host's family, like so many in Manteo, had a motorboat. He used it to take members of the Lost Colony Company water skiing. That's how he met Barber. God, could he ski, my host says. Soon Barber was giving him one-on-one lessons, teaching him how to slalom, to dance across the water. We talk of other main suspects, including a dentist and a troubled party boy who was the grandson of the local Episcopal priest. We talk about an African-American suspect from Manteo who was informed on by his white lover. Our chat winds back to Barber. On a morning shortly after Brenda vanished, my host met him at the downtown dock for his skiing lesson. Barber showed up on time, but he told him he couldn't give him his lesson. My host never got to talk to him again. Barber stayed in town for the rest of the Lost Colony season, but he was withdrawn as State Bureau of Investigation agents in the audience every night kept watch on him. My host keeps talking, recreating the island town of more than a half-century past and conveying the pulse of Manteo today. The times merge. Brenda Holland is out there still, calling to us from her last hours, the darkness before dawn on the first day of July 1967. Then, as now on Outer Banks nights, car headlights flash on girls and young women walking by the road. In some of those passing cars, local folks of long memory worry that those girls will not make it home. They think of Brenda. In the summer of 1967, the mystery of what happened to her went nationwide. Reporters in fedoras descended on the island. It was the biggest story in North Carolina, with each new revelation from investigators making front-page headlines in the newspapers, alongside stories of race riots in the big cities nationwide and President Johnson mired in the Vietnam War. Mothers on the beaches near Manteo hugged their babies all the tighter. Children shivered as their parents told them what they knew of Brenda's story, pointing to her photo in the 1967 Lost Colony program, and then turning the pages to a photo of Barber, saying he was the killer. The parents and reporters didn't know a fraction of the real story, which investigators closely guarded. The civilians didn't know about all the turns the case would take, some almost mystical, ranging from an apparent shallow grave to a candlelight seance to a surprise found hiding in a coffin. They didn't know about the mentally challenged local man, the town's unofficial night watchman, being targeted by a Manteo lawman. There was homophobia and racism as North Carolinians from afar urged investigators to check out well-known homosexuals or certain colored people. The locals, as always, wanted to know all they could about their fellow residents, whom they usually did not judge. But during that summer of 1967, the investigation infected Manteo. In a small town on a small island, family snitched on family and lovers on lovers. Neighbors informed on neighbors in clandestine, fear-filled meetings with investigators, and employers informed on employees. It was a summer so awash in booze that those grilled by investigators were all over the place about times and stories. You have to remember, an islander would say years later, everybody drank. But not the victim. Well, at least not hardly. All these years later, Brenda, who'd let a can of beer go hot before finishing it, jumps out at us still. In Manteo today, you can still talk to people who knew and loved her. That woman who descended from the cloud-splitting Smoky Mountains. Brenda rode into Manteo in her handmade but stylish clothes at the dawn of the summer of love, her mod colors and designs fitting with the mood of the company she joined. Even her black and white photo from the Lost Colony program captures her big eyes and welcoming smile. She spent just 1 month in Manteo, but her name will forever be linked with the town. One of the best months of her life, June 1967, ended, and her body was found floating in Albemarle Sound as July began. She'd been strangled and, quite possibly, raped. She was buried back up in the mountains on the day after what should have been her 20th birthday. A rain shower ended as they lowered her flower-draped white casket into her family plot in a valley just up the road from her home place. She did not like rain, but she came to love the ocean and wrote letters home of beach bonfires. She loved the way the sea bleached and transformed ordinary pieces of wood into strange and wonderful things, some that looked like beasts bounding on the beach, others like foreign animals at rest. She loved feeling the sand on her bare feet, watching dolphins play, and staring out at the limitless sea, ever changing from happy green to mean gray and all shades in between. She loved the way the morning mist rose off the sounds like ghosts in a place where the present and past blended, where locals still spoke in an Old English brogue. Tide was toid, and ice was oice. She loved the way sea breezes carried conversations, how you could stand on the beach and hear fragments of chats from 50 yards away. She poured her imagination into a play that ends with the question of what happened to the lost colony in the late 1500s. Andy Griffith got his start in the lost colony 20 years before, playing a soldier, then graduating in subsequent seasons to playing Sir Walter Raleigh, an Englishman with a southern accent, as Griffith once put it. He fell in love with Manteo. After the weekend performances of the pageant, Griffith, the comedian, would go on stage at a local club, testing his Hamlet monologue, a country boy's interpretation of Shakespeare that would become a classic. He made it in the TV production of No Time for Sergeants, and later in the Broadway play and film version by the same name. Soon thereafter, he landed his namesake show on TV, playing the sheriff in a small town called Mayberry, and had a sound front house in Manteo. He was often seen around barefoot, hanging out with the islanders. Observers from afar said that Mayberry was a fictional version of Griffith's hometown of Mount Airy, Andy's North Carolina hometown. But he would later say, "If Mayberry is anywhere, it is Manteo." Angel Ellis Coury writes in Manteo, a Roanoke Island town. Brenda stared wide-eyed at Griffith that summer when his show was a major primetime event. Brenda being Brenda, she might have glided up to him and asked for career connections and an autograph. Not for her, of course, but for her little brother and sister. She would have told herself that anyway. And then Brenda and her summer were gone. Key suspects went back to college, others remained on the island. For the general public, the terror visited on Brenda faded as the newspaper clippings about her case yellowed. There are hundreds of thousands of stories about the lost colonists and hundreds of books about them, but little is penned about Brenda. She floats alone in that summer of 1967. The trauma of what happened to her never ebbed for her parents, Jerry and Charles Wiley "Shotgun" Holland. 4 centuries before, John White, the governor of the Roanoke colony, may never have gotten over the mystery of what happened to his daughter Eleanor Dare, his granddaughter Virginia, and the rest of the lost colonists. It was personal for him, just as the mystery of what happened to their daughter Brenda was for her parents, gnawing at them all their days. The pain of losing a daughter transcends centuries. Just as Virginia Dare is locked away in memories of her as an infant, Brenda is locked in memories of her at 19. That trauma continues to this day for Brenda's siblings, and it continues for someone else, a woman who was tied as a child to one of the suspects. She and Brenda's siblings are bound in pain, if not in blood. Part 1. The Town and the Crime. Manteo, North Carolina, June and July 1967. Soaring. Dear folks, at this moment I'm looking down at the city of Fayetteville. There are millions of little lights, all colors, and then there's darkness. There are fewer lights now, and I can see few lights at all. We are awfully high up now. Everything is so hazy, kind of peaceful-like. Love, B. Brenda Joyce Holland, in a letter to her parents about her first flight, a January 25, 1967 trip to Washington, D.C. Around 9 a.m. on the last day of May, 1967, Darrell Midgett pulled his black Ford sedan up in front of the Spainhour boarding house where Brenda Holland lived in Buies Creek, North Carolina, and honked his horn. It was a town of a few hundred souls anchored by Campbell College, the school Darrell and Brenda attended. Up in her room, Brenda probably gave one last glimpse in the mirror. She would have seen big brown eyes and a warm smile, a face filled with openness. She wasn't perfect. There was a slight gap between her front teeth. That made her all the more attractive. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall and 120 pounds, long legs and model looks with a 19-inch waist. She would have given the hair one last pat. The hair that was newly cut short in a bob and dyed. Not even 3 weeks before, on Friday, May 12th, Brenda had written on her calendar in her bubbly cursive, "Became a blonde." Brenda of the brown locks no more. Her mother wouldn't approve, but her mother frosted her own brown hair, even if she didn't wear it in a modern bob. Brenda was headed to the Outer Banks, to Manteo, to work as the makeup supervisor for the Lost Colony outdoor drama on Roanoke Island. She was active in her college's theater community and dreamed of making a career in the field. She had studied the profession and the paths to success, including going to New York and waiting tables and other odd jobs while making connections. Brenda charted a more cautious path, realizing that her parents would never approve of her setting out for the Big Apple. She had to overcome her mother's objections just to get to college. She was the first person in her family to go, having just completed her sophomore year at Campbell, a small Baptist school about a 45-minute drive south of the state capital of Raleigh. Brenda knew that the Lost Colony had Broadway and Hollywood connections among its former and current casts. She battled her parents over her decision to take the theater job at the far end of their state. Brenda was pushing the boundaries, soaring past the cloistered culture in which she was raised in the western North Carolina mountains just outside Canton. Darrell, a biology major from Manteo and fellow sophomore she occasionally dated, was driving her down to the coast since she didn't have a car. He was tall with brown hair, active in student government, serious in his studies, but fun as well, the kind of guy who would do anything for his friends. He liked to sing and play his guitar, two of his favorites being the ballads Harbor Lights and Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. He was steady, accustomed to Brenda's effervescence. If she was giggly and anxious, he was as placid as the water and the sounds of his region on a good day. Protests for civil rights and against the Vietnam War were roiling campuses in other towns and cities. There was much talk of the establishment world of parents versus the anti-establishment world of their children, but not on the cozy Campbell campus. For this summer, anyway, the Lost Colony was calling Brenda away. She earned her job through her strong theater work at Campbell, which had close connections with the play. Paul Green, who wrote the play during the Great Depression, had grown up in Buies Creek. He embraced Roanoke Island, building on the enthusiasm the islanders had long had for telling their story and celebrating it. Brenda had never been to an island. The closest she had come was watching Gilligan's Island, the primetime TV comedy about a group of shipwrecked castaways. Brenda's parents hated the idea of her going to Manteo. They were mountain people, not coastal people. They'd never been to the Outer Banks. They wanted her to come back home that summer and resume her job at a local drive-in where she could make more money. Her dad was protective of his middle daughter. Brenda kept working on her parents, just as she had when she moved off campus to live at Mrs. Spainhour's boarding house. In a letter to her parents the previous January 26th about her first flight, a trip to Washington, D.C., she'd carefully dropped in her pitch for her off-campus move. She began the letter with, "Dear folks." Those folks were Charles Wiley Holland and Geraldine Ray Jerry Holland. Charles Holland was 5 feet 7 inches tall and maybe Mountain River wet 165 pounds. But he was all fight, a man whose friends had nicknamed him Shotgun for his outrages. After he graduated from high school, he went to work in the Canton paper mill like his father and many other relatives before him. When World War II broke out, he joined the Army. He served in Europe, driving officers around because he'd learned to speak French and German in high school. He rose to sergeant. He had a lively and active mind. He saw combat, for which he won a Bronze Star. He fought at the Battle of the Bulge. He was wiry and hard-drinking, tempered by his gentle bride who had taken his name before he shipped out for the war. Over there he savored the photos he'd taken of the petite and beautiful blue-eyed Jerry and punched out fellow servicemen who leered at those photos over his shoulder. In photos of him during the war, he comes across as darkly handsome and moody, like Montgomery Clift in From Here to Eternity, another story of World War II. Just as with Clift in the movie, Shotgun Holland was an underdog forever snarling from his chain. Jerry was smart, too, but had to drop out of school in the 7th grade to look after her younger siblings. She later got her GED. Shotgun came home when the war ended in 1945. He had seen his firstborn, Anne, just once, on leave before he shipped out. She was 3 when he returned. He went back to work at the mill. Its sprawling buildings anchored the town and stood tall over it. Its stacks constantly belched exhaust into the Smoky Mountains, leaving in its wake the smothering smell of sulfur like rotten eggs that the locals had long since accepted as the smell of money. Work in the mill was tedious and hard. Shotgun Holland and his family and friends punched the time clock. The paper mill was the only money game in town. Shotgun worked his way up to floor supervisor and, with Jerry, raised successively Anne, Brenda, Charles Hoyt, Little Charles, and the baby of the family, Kim. They lived in a brick house on Old Asheville Road in the shadow of Holland Mountain, which had been in Shotgun's family for generations. The war kept coming back to him, including memories of the blood-soaked snow of the Battle of the Bulge. He worked hard and played hard, retreating to his basement where he planted himself in his father's rocking chair by a wood stove. There he drank his bourbon and beer, smoked his cool cigarettes, watched TV, and stoked his wood stove and anger. The news reports were all about the Vietnam War and the hippies protesting it, barely mentioning his war. There were situation comedies about his war, like McHale's Navy about sailors in the South Pacific, and Hogan's Heroes with American soldiers in a prisoner of war camp in Germany. But those shows were free of the brutality he saw. He turned the dial on his TV to Western dramas. He knew they weren't realistic either, but they were not as insulting as the war comedies. Sometimes when he was drunk, Shotgun would punish his children for what he saw as transgressions, ripping off his belt and whipping them. Brenda once ran to a relative's house after he whipped her. Jerry and Shotgun argued about his drinking. They fought about money. Jerry liked nice things. For a while, she had this big car. "When you have a Cadillac," she said, "people just notice you." Shotgun would slap, push, and shove Jerry in front of their children. The scenes haunted Brenda. Jerry would flee with the children, going to a relative's house and returning after a few days. Wherever his war memories might take him, Shotgun Holland's children were his life. He would kill for them. The Hollands were not wealthy, but they had land. Shotgun Holland, wearing his fatigue jacket from the war, would lead his children through briars to the top of their mountain, to a place where their ancestors had lived in a log cabin that still stood. Near high cliffs, Shotgun would tell his children about the Indians buried up there in the clouds, the wolves that once roamed, and how one of his ancestors had killed a man on the mountain trail in an argument over a woman.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?